me, ready to jump into some global politics today.
Always up for that.
Okay, good. Because sometimes these elections that happen halfway across the world, they can feel a million miles away, right?
What do you mean?
But this year's Sri Lankan presidential election, wow, talk about a political thriller.
No kidding. Full of surprises, unexpected turns, and honestly, some really important lessons for all of us, no matter where we live.
Exactly. So we're diving deep today into why Ranil, someone who's been a major force in Sri Lankan politics, ended up losing.
It is pretty fascinating when you think about it.
And to help us untangle all this, we're looking at an episode from the Trendline podcast.
Oh, they're good.
They're fantastic. They really know how to explain even the most complicated political situations in a way that anyone can understand.
And they did a deep dive on this election, right?
They sure did. Focused on why Wickremesinghe lost, which, on the surface, it was a real head-scratcher. But then you dig a little deeper with these guys and...
things start to make a lot more sense.
Right. So, first things first, gotta set the scene a bit. And one phrase the Trendline folks used really stuck with me. The economic hangover.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Isn't it? It's like this economic crisis that hit Sri Lanka. It wasn't some abstract thing, it was like this heavy weight on everyone's shoulders. Like, imagine the worst smell of burnt toast ever.
And it just lingers and lingers, and you can't escape it.
Exactly. It was in every part of daily life.
And you can see why that would matter in an election. People don't vote based on some far-off economic theory. They vote based on what they're experiencing every day in their own homes.
So true. So we're talking about, like, families struggling to buy food because prices are through the roof, right?
Right, and then you've got the constant worry about fuel shortages, which just throws everything out of whack.
So stressful. I mean, can you imagine trying to live your life, get to work, get your kids to school with that hanging over your head?
It'd be incredibly disruptive. And you start to feel incredibly uncertain about the future, like what's next. And in that kind of situation, it's only natural for people to start looking at their leaders differently.
It's like, okay, we get it, there's a crisis, but what are you going to do about it?
Exactly. And that's the key point here, I think. It's not always the crisis itself that makes or breaks a leader. It's how they respond to it.
And maybe more importantly, how the voters perceive that response.
100%. Because if it doesn't feel like you're doing enough, or that you're even trying to understand what people are going through, well,
they're going to look for someone who they think will.
It's almost inevitable. People want to feel heard. They want to feel like their leaders get it, that they're in their corner. And when that's missing, it can create this real hunger for change, a desire for something new. And sometimes that new thing is a new person in charge.
It's true. And this yearning for new leadership, it was definitely swirling around in Sri Lanka. Like I was saying earlier, it's like when your favorite band's been around forever, the music's good, but at some point...
you're ready for something different.
100%. So we've got this economic anxiety, we've got people craving change, and on top of that, Wickremesinghe, this guy who's been a fixture in Sri Lankan politics for years.
He ends up being seen as the embodiment of the status quo.
Which, in this climate, not a good look. But I'm kind of curious, the Trendline podcast, they didn't really get into why people saw him that way, did they?
I don't think they did. They mentioned it. But yeah, it would have been interesting to hear more about what specifically made him the status quo guy in everyone's minds.
Right. Like what policies, what actions, or maybe even inactions kind of cemented that image for voters.
Because, yeah, just saying someone represents the status quo, that doesn't really tell us the whole story.
Exactly. A little more context there would have been great. But anyway, it wasn't just about him, right? It wasn't like a one-on-one match. He had other opponents to worry about, too.
Oh, he did. It wasn't a two-horse race. It was more like a whole pack of horses. A seriously crowded field.
Okay, so usually you'd think, hey, lots of challengers, that actually helps the incumbent.
Right.
Because it splits the vote.
You'd think so, right? It's that classic divide and conquer strategy.
But the Trendline folks pointed out something really interesting.
What's that?
So in past elections, Wickremesinghe, he actually benefited from having a more unified opposition. Like, his opponents were more organized, which seems counterintuitive, but...
But having everyone on the same page, ironically, might have helped him in those earlier races. Fascinating.
Isn't it? Because this time around, the field was wide open, and it worked against him.
Wow, so it was like the opposite of what you'd expect. A totally different dynamic.
So let's recap. Economic woes, check. A desire for new leadership, check. And to top it all off, a whole lineup of opponents all vying for the presidency.
Talk about a recipe for an upset. But hold on, we're not done yet, are we? There's another piece to this puzzle, and it's a big one.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say. Social media.
Had to address the digital elephant in the room.
Right. Because these days, can you even have an election without it? So how did social media play into this whole thing?
Well, according to the Trendline podcast, it was a game changer, especially for the newer candidates. They were all over platforms like Twitter and Instagram, engaging with voters directly.
They were living rent-free in everyone's feeds.
Exactly. They knew how to leverage those platforms, particularly for reaching younger voters. Crafting that shareable content, jumping into conversations, even using memes to their advantage.
Meanwhile, how was Wickremesinghe's campaign using social media?
Let's just say they weren't quite as digitally savvy. It was a much more traditional approach.
Like showing up to a rap battle with a sonnet, you've got to adapt or risk getting left behind.
And in this case, I think that's a big part of what happened. The newer candidates, they understood the assignment. They knew how to connect with voters where they were at, and it gave them a real edge.
So if I'm keeping track, we've got economic worries making people nervous, a real desire for something new, a whole bunch of challengers ready to step in, and then to top it all off, this whole social media thing where some candidates were killing it and others, well.
Let's just say they weren't quite as digitally fluent.
Exactly. And when you put it all together like that, it's almost like, was anyone surprised that Wickremesinghe lost?
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? And I think that's what's so fascinating about this particular election. It wasn't just one mistake or one factor that led to his loss. It was this perfect storm of all these larger trends kind of colliding at once.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder for anyone in politics, right? Times are changing and so are voters, so you better keep up. Like, if someone with Wickremesinghe's experience and history in Sri Lankan politics can get swept aside like this, what does that say to other leaders who've been around for a while?
It's a message, that's for sure. A message that says you can't just rest on your laurels. You can't assume that what worked before will automatically work again. The world is changing so fast, and that includes what voters expect from their leaders.
You always have to be adapting, always be learning, and especially you've got to be able to connect with people where they are. And in today's world, that increasingly means online.
100%.
Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job untangling this election, wouldn't you say?
I think so. We've covered a lot of ground.
And what's amazing is that this is just one election in one country. But the trends we're talking about, these are things happening all over the world.
Absolutely. And it makes you think, are we seeing similar things happening in our own countries, in our own backyards?
Right. It's definitely something to think about. But for now, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Sri Lankan presidential election. It's been enlightening. And remember, the world of global politics never sleeps, so who knows what we'll be unpacking next time. Catch you then.